A colossal stone guardian hides a secret in plain sight. The Great Sphinx of Giza may be thousands of years older than anyone ever taught you, and its weathered surface holds the proof. By the end of this investigation, you will see this iconic monument not as a solved puzzle, but as the center of a scientific controversy that could rewrite history itself. What if the Sphinx was carved not for a pharaoh, but by a forgotten civilization during an age when the Sahara was green? What do the scars on its stone actually tell us? How much of our past remains buried, not in sand, but in our own assumptions? When you look at ancient wonders, do you see finished stories or unanswered questions? That gaze across the desert has held for millennia, a silent sentinel anchored to our understanding of ancient Egypt. According to the story told in history books and by most guides at the site, this monumental figure was carved during the reign of the Pharaoh Khafre, around 2,500 years before the Common Era. It is presented as a powerful piece of royal symbolism, a guardian lion with the face of a king, meant to watch over the pyramid complex and assert divine authority for eternity. This attribution provides a neat and tidy slot in the grand timeline, placing the Sphinx firmly within the architectural boom of Egypt's Old Kingdom. For a long time, that answer seemed sufficient. It created a coherent picture of a pharaoh commissioning his eternal likeness from the living rock, a masterpiece completed within a known cultural and technological framework. The surface of the statue, however, whispers a different tale. Look beyond its missing nose and the marks of time, and you see something far more intriguing: deep vertical fissures and undulating, scooped-out hollows that scar its limestone core. These are not the sharp, angular cuts left by wind-blown sand, the primary force shaping the Egyptian desert for the last 4,500 years. These patterns look rounded, fluid, almost like something was poured over the stone for a very, very long time. They are the first visible clue that the environment which shaped the Sphinx might have been dramatically different from the arid plateau we see today. This is where the serene certainty of the established narrative begins to show its first hairline fractures. The stone itself became a witness. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Dr. Robert Schoch approached the Sphinx not as an archaeologist searching for inscriptions, but as a scientist reading the autobiography of rock. His trained eye saw past the artistic majesty to the physical evidence etched into the limestone. What he documented were not the sharp, sand-blasted facets one would expect from millennia of desert winds. Instead, the body of the Sphinx and the deep walls of the pit that surrounds it are marked by deep vertical fissures and smooth, undulating hollows like the surface of a sea cave. To a geologist, these are unmistakable signatures. This is precipitation-induced weathering, the kind of erosion caused by water, specifically by heavy, persistent rainfall pouring over the stone for centuries. Wind and sand sculpt with a harsh, abrasive touch, but water works with a patient, dissolving flow, carving these distinctive rounded contours. Schoch presented a startling conclusion. For the Sphinx to bear these particular scars, it must have stood exposed during a period when the climate of the Giza Plateau was dramatically wetter. According to the geological record, the last time the region experienced such a sustained, rainy climate ended around the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era. That is over 1,000 years before the reign of the Pharaoh Khafre, to whom the Sphinx is traditionally attributed. In one geological assessment, the timeline of human history in Egypt was called into question. The monument was no longer just a statue, it had become a climate archive, its weathered skin a page from a forgotten chapter of the Earth's own story. This geological evidence points to a world that no longer exists. To truly grasp the water erosion theory, we must erase the image of the endless, golden desert that frames the Sphinx today. Rewind the climate clock, and a startlingly different landscape emerges. For thousands of years, roughly from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert at all. This was the African humid period, an epoch when shifting global weather patterns brought consistent monsoon rains far north of where they fall now. The region we call the Sahara transformed into a green mosaic of sprawling savannas, dotted with vast lakes and crisscrossed by flowing rivers. Herds of animals grazed where only dunes persist today, and human communities thrived in this fertile environment. This was the stage, a wet and vibrant world. Then, slowly, the rains retreated. The lakes evaporated, the rivers vanished, and the green gave way to the relentless beige of sand. By around 5,000 years ago, the desert had firmly reclaimed its throne. This climatic timeline is the second, crucial pillar of the argument. Dr. Schoch and his colleagues connected the dots. The type of deep, runoff weathering seen on the Sphinx requires exactly the kind of heavy, prolonged rainfall that characterized that green Sahara period. For the monument to bear these specific water scars, they reasoned, its limestone core must have been exposed to the elements, actively eroding during that last major wet phase. That simple geological alignment pushes the timeline back dramatically. If the statue was already standing and weathering significantly by the end of the humid period, its initial construction could logically be placed much earlier, potentially in the 7th millennium before the Common Era or even before. This is not just a shift of a few centuries, it is a leap of millennia. Suddenly, the Sphinx is no longer a proud achievement of the pyramid-building Old Kingdom. It becomes a potential artifact from a shadowy, pre-dynastic age, a relic from a time when the land around it was alive with water and life, a monument possibly built by a culture lost to the very sands that now preserve it. The implications are profound, transforming the Sphinx from a solved piece of pharaonic history into a silent question mark from a forgotten world. A geologist walked onto an archaeological stage and asked a simple question. What story does the stone tell? Dr. Robert Schoch was not an Egyptologist by training. He held a doctorate in geology and geophysics from Yale University, and his expertise was in reading the Earth's history written in layers of rock. When he first examined the Sphinx in the early 1990s, he applied that exact lens. He ignored the debates about pharaohs and dynasties for a moment and focused solely on the physical evidence, the actual surface of the monument and the enclosure it sits within. His formal analysis was meticulous, mapping the deep, vertical fissures and the distinctive, rounded hollows that cover the limestone core. To his trained eye, the verdict was clear and grounded in basic geological principles. This was not the pattern left by wind and sand, which scours and pits in a specific way. This was the signature of precipitation, of water flowing over the stone in sheets for century after century. The most pronounced erosion, he noted, was not on the upper, more exposed parts of the statue, but on the walls of the surrounding pit, where runoff would have pooled and concentrated its force. This detail was critical. It pointed to a prolonged period of significant rainfall, the kind that simply had not fallen on Giza for over 5,000 years. Armed with this data, Schoch stepped into the spotlight at a major scientific conference in 1991 and presented a hypothesis that felt less like a new idea and more like a tremor through the foundations of history. He proposed that the core body of the Sphinx was far older than anyone believed, with a construction date likely reaching back to 5,000 years before the Common Era or even earlier. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Here was a credentialed scientist using the hard language of geology, suggesting that one of the world's most iconic monuments might predate known Egyptian civilization by millennia. Schoch's work became a powerful lesson in interdisciplinary thinking. He proved that the secrets of the past are not always recorded in human language. Sometimes the most honest testimony is etched silently into stone, waiting for someone with the right eyes to read it. The geologist's hypothesis did not simply land on the academic stage, it detonated. The response from mainstream Egyptology was not merely skeptical, it was a swift and formidable defense of the established timeline. Leading figures in the field, including the charismatic and often outspoken Dr. Zahi Hawass, then Egypt's preeminent antiquities authority, and the highly respected archaeologist Mark Lehner, who has spent decades mapping Giza, presented a powerful counterargument. Their position was not based on a denial of the erosion, but on a completely different interpretation of its cause. They pointed to other forces that could have shaped the stone. The relentless scouring of wind-driven sand, they argued, could produce rounded features over sufficient time. They suggested chemical weathering from centuries of morning dew condensing on the cool limestone, or even the effects of occasional but powerful rainstorms in later periods, where runoff from the higher plateau might have cascaded into the Sphinx enclosure. Their core argument, however, went beyond geology into the very heart of archaeological methodology. Where was the evidence for the builders? If a sophisticated culture existed in the Nile Valley thousands of years before the pharaohs, capable of carving a monument of such scale and precision, it would have left a trail. Where were their settlements, their tools, their pottery, their burials, their own cultural artifacts? The archaeological record of pre-dynastic Egypt, while rich, shows no sign of a society with the centralized organization, manpower, or symbolic tradition required for the Sphinx. This created a stark impasse. On one side, a geologist reading the direct physical testimony of the rock. On the other, archaeologists holding fast to a fundamental principle, that monuments cannot be divorced from the material culture of the people who created them. This was no longer just a debate about weathering patterns. It was a clash between two different ways of knowing the past, one reading the book of the earth, the other reading the book of human civilization, and each claiming the other's story had missing pages. But the geological argument does not stand alone. The case for the Sphinx's great age gains even more compelling support when we look at its immediate surroundings. Directly in front of the monument sit two ancient structures known as the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. These are not later additions, they are integral parts of the original complex, constructed from the very same massive limestone core blocks that were quarried from around the Sphinx as it was being carved. The stones literally connect them, a physical bond that ties their histories together. And here is the crucial detail. The walls of these temples show the exact same type of deep, undulating, rounded erosion. They bear the same water scars. This correlation is powerful. It means these structures were not just built at the same time, they weathered together, exposed to the same environmental conditions for a very long period. If the erosion was a later phenomenon caused by something like rising groundwater or unique drainage issues after the Old Kingdom, we might expect to see different patterns on the older Sphinx versus the younger temples. But the weathering is consistent, a uniform signature across the entire complex. This strongly suggests that the heavy, water-based erosion began soon after construction, while all the stone surfaces were freshly exposed and vulnerable. They were all subjected to that same punishing climate simultaneously, so the question becomes, when was that climate? If the temples are traditionally dated to the Old Kingdom, but their stone tells a story of a much wetter world, we face a contradiction. The shared erosion pattern acts like a timestamp, linking the fate of the entire Sphinx complex to that distant era of green Sahara rains. It transforms a single geological observation into a broader architectural testimony, where every carved block in the plaza seems to whisper the same ancient secret. Yet science rarely speaks directly to the public. For a geological hypothesis to truly shake the foundations of history, it needed a storyteller. enter John Anthony West, an independent researcher and author whose passion for ancient mysteries burned with an intensity that matched his formidable intellect. While Robert Schoch provided the rigorous scientific analysis, West became the theory's charismatic and unyielding evangelist. He did not discover the water erosion patterns, but he recognized their earth-shattering implications long before most, drawing inspiration from the earlier, esoteric work of a French Egyptologist named R.A. Schwaller de Lubic's, who had first suggested the Sphinx showed signs of water where in the 1950s, West took that obscure observation and built a grand narrative around it. For him, the weathered Sphinx was not merely older, it was a smoking gun, proof positive of a lost epoch of human achievement. He spoke of a sophisticated precursor civilization, perhaps even the legendary Atlantis, whose knowledge was later inherited and preserved by the dynastic Egyptians. This was a sweeping, provocative vision, far more radical than a simple revision of dates. West's greatest impact, however, came not from his books but from a television screen. His Emmy Award-winning documentary, The Mystery of the Sphinx, hosted by none other than Charlton Heston, brought Schoch's geological evidence into living rooms around the world. The program masterfully juxtaposed the clear, logical explanations of a scientist with stunning visuals of the erosion patterns, framing the whole debate as a classic confrontation between rigid orthodoxy and brave, empirical truth-seeking. The documentary was a cultural event. It forced Egyptologists out of their academic journals and onto mainstream media to defend their position, often appearing flustered by the directness of the challenge. In doing so, John Anthony West demonstrated something profound. He showed that the gates of historical debate could be stormed not just by peer-reviewed papers, but by compelling storytelling and public engagement. He made millions of people look at the Sphinx and ask for the very first time a question that had been buried in the sand for centuries: what if we have been wrong all along? The stone's testimony is not without its own courtroom debate. For every expert who sees the clear signature of ancient rain, another points to the relentless, abrasive forces of the desert itself. The primary counterargument rests on a simple, observable fact: wind-blown sand is a powerful sculptor. Over thousands of years, storms carrying countless grains of silica can act like a natural sandblaster, scouring and smoothing even the hardest stone. Proponents of the conventional timeline argue that the peculiar contours on the Sphinx could be the result of this very process, where prevailing winds, channeled by the monument's own shape and the enclosure walls, preferentially eroded the softer layers of limestone, creating those undulating hollows. It is a compelling point. The desert has had more than enough time to do its work. Adding another layer to this explanation is a more subtle geological process called haloclasty. This occurs when moisture from sources like morning dew or capillary action from groundwater seeps into the porous limestone. As the water evaporates, it leaves behind tiny crystals of salt. These crystals grow, exerting immense pressure from within the stone, slowly prying apart its microscopic structure and causing the surface to flake and spoil away. Combined with the dramatic temperature swings of the desert, where rock expands by day and contracts by night, this creates a cycle of stress and exfoliation. Together, these forces, wind abrasion, salt crystallization, and thermal expansion, could theoretically produce rounded, weathered features without requiring a single drop of prolonged rainfall. This is the heart of the mainstream scientific response, an attempt to explain the unusual erosion by amplifying the known, current climate of Giza over an immense timescale, keeping the Sphinx comfortably within the age of the pharaohs. It is a reminder that in geology, as in history, the same set of marks can often be read in more than one way. The debate over surface erosion is only one layer of this mystery. To truly understand the Sphinx, we must look beneath its feet into the very ground it guards. In the 1990s, a team of researchers led by the geophysicist Dr. Thomas Dobke brought a different kind of tool to the plateau: seismic refraction technology. This method is akin to giving the Earth an ultrasound, sending sound waves into the ground and measuring their echoes to map subsurface structures. The team conducted a survey around the Sphinx, and the results sent a new ripple of excitement through the community. The data revealed several intriguing anomalies, regions beneath the monument where the sound waves behaved unexpectedly, suggesting possible voids or chambers in the bedrock. The most prominent of these anomalies appeared to be located under the Sphinx's front paws, a large, rectangular-shaped region with distinctly different density than the surrounding limestone. Other, smaller anomalies were detected along the northern flank. The immediate implication was tantalizing. Could there be hidden rooms sealed for millennia, waiting beneath the stone guardian? The researchers were careful to state that their findings indicated possible cavities, not confirmed chambers, and that natural geological features like fissures or pockets of less dense rock could produce similar readings. Yet the possibility was enough to ignite the imagination. If man-made chambers do exist, and if they are original to the monument's construction, they could represent the ultimate time capsule. Within such spaces, one could theoretically find the very evidence that mainstream archaeology says is missing: artifacts, inscriptions, or offerings left by the builders themselves. It would be a direct link to the minds and hands that carved the Colossus, potentially offering names, tools, or symbols that could finally anchor the Sphinx to a specific time and culture. This prospect transforms the geological debate into a tangible quest. The question is no longer just about reading weathered stone, but about what might lie in the darkness below, holding secrets the surface has long since surrendered to time. This leaves us with two competing timelines, each written in a different language. One is inscribed in stone, the other in the artifacts of human culture. The geological timeline, anchored by the water erosion hypothesis, draws a stark line. For the Sphinx to bear the deep, rounded scars of precipitation, it must have been standing exposed during the last great wet phase of the Sahara, which definitively ended around 5,000 years before the Common Era. After that point, the climate shifted, the rains retreated, and the desert became the dominant sculptor. So, from a purely geological perspective, the significant weathering had to occur before that climatic curtain fell. This suggests a monument already ancient by the dawn of dynastic Egypt. The historical and archaeological timeline, however, paints a very different picture. Our material record shows a clear and gradual evolution in the Nile Valley. We see the development of pottery, agriculture, and small-scale settlements. The first known attempts at monumental stonework appear much later, with the mastaba tombs of early kings, leading to the step pyramid of Djoser around 2650 before the Common Era. The grand perfection of the Giza pyramids and traditionally the Sphinx comes later still. There is simply no archaeological evidence, no tools, no settlements, no precursor monuments that indicates a society in the region capable of such a project in the 7th or 6th millennium before the Common Era. This creates a gap of at least 2,000 years, a vast silence between what the stones seem to say and what our shovels have found. Reconciling these two stories is the ultimate puzzle. Either the geological interpretation is mistaken, and other forces like wind and salt created the illusion of water where over a shorter time, or our understanding of human prehistory is missing a monumental piece. The latter possibility is what ignites the imagination. It hints not at a minor dating error, but at a lost chapter, a culture that achieved a profound level of skill and organization, only to vanish so completely that even the memory of their achievement was inherited by later peoples as a mystery. This gap is not just empty time, it is a question mark at the very foundation of our story. The gap between these timelines is not merely an academic disagreement, it is a chasm that could swallow our understanding of human beginnings. If the water erosion theory is correct, its implications are staggering. It suggests the existence of a sophisticated, organized society capable of large-scale stone carving during the Neolithic period, a time when, according to our current textbooks, human communities in the region were transitioning from nomadic hunting to settled farming. We are talking about a period long before the invention of writing or the wheel in Egypt, before the first cities, before the concept of a pharaoh. To carve the Sphinx, a culture would have needed not just the artistic vision, but the social structure to coordinate a workforce, the engineering knowledge to quarry and shape 200 tons of limestone, and the long-term purpose to see such a decades-long project through. This was not a simple society of scattered villages. It was a civilization in every meaningful sense of the word. Its existence would force a radical re-evaluation of the entire trajectory of human development. The Standard Model shows a slow, linear climb from simple to complex. This idea introduces a startling possibility, a peak of achievement much earlier, followed by a decline or transformation so complete that its memory faded into myth. It transforms the Sphinx from a proud masterpiece of the Pyramid Age into something far more mysterious, a legacy monument. Think of it as a message in stone from a world before history as we know it began, left by a people whose name we have forgotten, whose cities may lie buried beneath the Sahara's sands. Their knowledge, their techniques, their very understanding of the world may have been the foundational layer upon which dynastic Egypt later built its glory. The Sphinx then becomes not a beginning but an echo, a powerful reminder that our past may be deeper, stranger, and far more resilient than any single story can contain. Look closer and the Sphinx begins to tell two different stories at once. The fifth clue lies not in what is uniform, but in what is starkly different. The monument's massive, recumbent body and the deep walls of its enclosure are deeply scarred by those distinctive, rounded hollows and vertical fissures. Yet gaze up at the iconic head and the weathering pattern changes. The head is noticeably less eroded with sharper, more defined features and, crucially, different types of marks. This is differential erosion, a geological term for when different materials wear away at different rates. The head is carved from a harder, more durable layer of limestone, a natural capstone that was more resistant to whatever forces were at work. But the disparity goes beyond simple hardness. Some researchers point to the tool marks. The body's surface, where it hasn't been heavily weathered, shows evidence of what appears to be precipitation-induced erosion over tooling. The head, however, displays tool marks that some argue are more consistent with the bronze chisels of the dynastic Egyptian era. This discrepancy fuels a provocative theory. Could the head we see today be a revision? The original Sphinx, some propose, was a complete lion statue, its head proportionate to its majestic leonine body. Centuries or even millennia later, a pharaoh's sculptors could have recarved that weathered lion's head into a human likeness, a practice not uncommon in Egyptian history where statues were often repurposed. This would explain the glaring size mismatch, where the small, finely detailed human head seems oddly perched atop the massive, powerfully built body of a lion. The differential erosion adds a compelling layer. If the body was exposed to heavy rainfall for a long period, acquiring its deep scars, but the head was either protected or recarved much later from that harder stone, it would create exactly the puzzling contrast we observe. Alternatively, the body's erosion might be so severe because the builders themselves quarried into rock that was already deeply weathered by ancient rains, sculpting a monument from a landscape that held the memory of a forgotten climate. Each possibility turns the Sphinx into a palimpsest, a stone canvas written and rewritten by both human hands and the patient, relentless pen of time. But the stone we see today is not the stone that weathered those ancient rains. The Sphinx is a living monument, not in the biological sense, but in the sense that it has been constantly tended to, repaired, and altered by human hands for thousands of years. This long history of restoration adds a profound layer of complexity to the entire debate. From the time of the pharaohs themselves, who likely made repairs to their own already ancient guardian, through the Roman period, and right up to the major modern efforts led by Zahi Hawass in the 1980s, the Sphinx has been a patient in an ongoing clinic. These repairs used everything from ancient limestone blocks to modern cement mortar, each effort leaving its own mark on the statue's skin. For a geologist trying to read the original story, this is a formidable challenge. It means the surface we are studying is a mosaic, a patchwork of original core stone, ancient repair blocks, and modern materials. Critics of the water erosion theory point directly to this history. They argue that much of the severe damage we see, particularly on the body and the enclosure walls, is not the result of primordial downpours. Instead, they trace it to more recent causes. In medieval times, people quarried stone directly from the Sphinx for building projects elsewhere, leaving fresh, raw scars. Later, well-intentioned but poorly executed restorations used incompatible materials that did more harm than good. A particularly problematic chapter occurred in the 20th century, when restoration teams used modern cement to plug holes and secure blocks. Unlike the porous limestone, this hard cement trapped moisture inside the statue. As that moisture expanded and contracted with temperature changes, it caused the surrounding ancient stone to crack and flake off in a process called spalling, creating new damage that can look, to an untrained eye, like very old erosion. This highlights the central difficulty of studying the Sphinx. It is not a pristine artifact unearthed from a sealed tomb. It is an icon that has stood in the open, battling the elements and being repaired by every generation that revered it. The original surface is partially obscured, not by sand, but by the well-intentioned hands of time itself, making the search for a clear geological signal an act of delicate archaeological detective work. The scientific debate opens a door, but imagination rushes through it. For many, the water erosion theory is more than a geological footnote. It is a master key, unlocking grander visions of a forgotten past. This is where the conversation shifts from academic journals to the realms of alternative history and esoteric thought. Here, the Sphinx transforms from a weathered statue into a guardian of secrets, its true purpose shrouded in legend. One of the most persistent of these legends speaks of a hall of records. This is not a metaphor, but a literal, physical library said to lie in chambers deep beneath the monument's paws. According to this lore, this hall contains the accumulated wisdom of a lost civilization, archives of advanced knowledge on everything from astronomy to spirituality, preserved on indestructible tablets or scrolls. It is a captivating idea, a literal treasure trove of answers waiting in the dark. This legend often intertwines with stories of mythical lands like Atlantis or Lemuria, suggesting that the Sphinx is not an Egyptian creation at all, but a relic from a drowned world, a marker left by survivors. Proponents of these views see the water erosion as perfect corroboration. If the Sphinx is thousands of years older than Egypt, they argue, then who but an advanced pre-flood civilization could have built it? The monument becomes a time capsule from a golden age, and its weathered flanks are the scars from the great cataclysm that ended that age. While these narratives lack the empirical evidence demanded by mainstream archaeology, they are powerful in their own right. They speak to a deep human yearning, a suspicion that our history is richer and stranger than the official record allows. The water erosion theory, with its scientific veneer, provides the perfect anchor for these speculations, a tangible clue that seems to validate an intangible longing. It shows how a single geological observation can become the foundation for an entire mythology of origins, proving that the Sphinx's greatest power may not be in the answers it gives, but in the endless questions it inspires. The evidence cannot stand in isolation. To test any hypothesis, we must look for patterns, for echoes of the same effect in other places. This brings us to a powerful argument used by those who defend the traditional age of the Sphinx. If its deep, rounded scars were truly carved by thousands of years of heavy rainfall, then we should find similar scars elsewhere. The landscape of Egypt is an open-air museum of ancient stone, offering countless comparison points. The most obvious are the Great Pyramids themselves, standing just a few hundred meters away. They were constructed from similar Giza Plateau limestone blocks, quarried from the same geological formation. These pyramids have stood exposed to the elements for almost the same amount of time as the Sphinx, according to the conventional timeline, yet their surfaces tell a different story. The pyramids show the classic weathering of the arid desert. Their faces are marked by the abrasive, sand-blasted texture of wind erosion, with sharp angles and pitted surfaces. They do not display the deep, undulating, channel-like hollows or the pronounced vertical fissures seen so dramatically on the Sphinx enclosure walls. The weathering is uniform, a testament to sand and wind, not flowing water. This contrast is stark and immediately visible. It poses a direct challenge. If the same climate that weathered the Sphinx also weathered the pyramids, why do the two monuments wear the marks of two completely different worlds? The logical conclusion for many scholars is simple. The pyramids and the Sphinx were not exposed to the same long-term environmental conditions because they were built in different climatic eras. The pyramids were built in the dry desert we know, while the Sphinx, they argue, must have been shaped by something else. The search for comparable erosion extends beyond Giza. Archaeologists point to even older structures like the mastaba tombs at Saqqara. These are flat-roofed, rectangular tombs built for early pharaohs and nobles, dating back to the early dynastic period, around 2,900 years before the Common Era. That makes them, in the traditional view, several centuries older than the Sphinx. These tombs are also constructed from limestone, and they have been sitting out in the open for nearly 5,000 years. If a prolonged rainy period was the primary erosive force on the plateau for millennia, these older mastabas should be the most weathered of all, exhibiting the most severe water damage. But they do not. The mastabas show deterioration, of course, but it is the deterioration of time in a dry climate. The edges are softened, blocks may have shifted or been robbed, but they lack the signature, flowing contours of precipitation runoff. There is no evidence of those deep vertical channels cutting through their sides. This absence is critical. It creates a chronological puzzle for the water erosion theory. If the Sphinx is so much older that it witnessed a wet climate, then structures that are, in the standard model, even older than the Sphinx should show the same or worse water damage. The fact that they do not suggests one of two things. Either the water erosion on the Sphinx is not from ancient rains, but from another, more localized cause, or our understanding of the dates for all these structures is profoundly wrong. For mainstream Egyptology, the clean, logical consistency of the archaeological record is the deciding factor. The mastabas, the pyramids, the temples, all fit within a climatic framework that has been dry for the last 5,000 years. The Sphinx, with its anomalous erosion, becomes the outlier, and the explanation must therefore lie in a unique local condition, not a rewritten global climate history. This comparative analysis is often presented as the fatal flaw in the water erosion hypothesis. The argument is elegant in its simplicity. We have a control group, a collection of dated stone monuments across Egypt. They show a consistent weathering profile aligned with a dry desert environment. The Sphinx is the one exception. In science, when you have a single outlier, you first question the outlier, not the entire established model. Scholars argue that the unique erosion on the Sphinx can be explained by its unique situation. It sits at the bottom of a deep limestone pit, which would have acted as a natural catchment for any water, not just from rain but from groundwater seepage or occasional Nile floods in antiquity. The stone of the Sphinx body itself is of a particularly poor quality, a soft, layered limestone that is far more vulnerable to all forms of decay, including salt crystallization and exfoliation, than the harder stone used in the pyramids or selected for the Sphinx's head. The combination of its low-lying position, its vulnerable geology, and perhaps even the effects of those poorly conducted modern restorations could have created a perfect storm of decay that looks dramatic and unique. Therefore, they conclude, we do not need to invoke a lost rainy age to explain the Sphinx's wounds. We only need to understand the specific, unfortunate circumstances of its location and composition. This perspective reframes the mystery. The Sphinx is not a messenger from a wetter world, but a monument built in a dry one, whose very form and placement destined it to weather in a uniquely dramatic way. The question then shifts from when it was built to why it was built in such a vulnerable spot, and what that might tell us about the intentions of its creators. Yet this is far more than a polite disagreement between scholars. To understand the ferocity of the resistance, we must look beyond the geology and into the very human landscape of history itself. For Egypt, the Sphinx and the pyramids are not just ancient relics, they are pillars of national identity and cultural pride. The established timeline, placing these wonders within the golden age of the pharaohs, forms the bedrock of a story told to every Egyptian schoolchild and to millions of visitors each year. This narrative is powerful. It speaks to a continuous, magnificent heritage, a source of unity and global fascination. The tourism industry, a vital part of Egypt's economy, is built upon this compelling pharaonic brand. To suggest that the iconic Sphinx might belong to a completely different, unknown culture predating the dynastic Egyptians is not just revising a date. It is seen by some as challenging a foundational element of modern Egyptian identity. The potential ripple effects are profound, touching everything from museum exhibits to history textbooks. From this perspective, the water erosion theory is not merely an alternative hypothesis. It feels like an external challenge to a nation's own story about itself. On the academic side, the stakes are equally personal and professional. The careers of countless Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians are built upon the established chronology. Decades of meticulous research, published papers, academic reputations, and entire life's works are anchored to the framework that places the Sphinx firmly in the Old Kingdom. This framework is the map they have used to navigate every discovery, the context for interpreting every artifact and inscription. Accepting a radical redating would not be a simple update. It would be a painful paradigm shift. It would mean that fundamental assumptions about the development of Egyptian civilization, its technology, and its social organization were built on a shaky premise. Volumes of scholarship would suddenly require re-evaluation, not as minor corrections, but as potentially misdirected efforts. The human instinct in any field is to protect the edifice of knowledge one has helped to build. When new evidence threatens to shake that edifice, the initial reaction is often a vigorous defense, a scrutiny of the new data that can border on hostility. This is not necessarily about closed-mindedness, but about the immense intellectual and emotional investment in a particular story of the past. So when a geologist points to watermarks on stone, he is not just reading rock, he is inadvertently questioning the control of history itself. The debate becomes a clash between two very different forms of authority. On one side is the authority of the established discipline, built on a century of archaeological excavation, linguistic study, and cultural interpretation. On the other is the authority of empirical, physical data from a separate scientific field. It is a battle where data meets dogma, where a single observation from outside the guild challenges the guild's most cherished timeline. The reputation of Egyptology as a precise, scientific endeavor can feel at stake. To admit that such a central monument might have been misdated for so long could be perceived as an admission of failure, a crack in the discipline's credibility. This explains the sometimes personal nature of the criticisms, the dismissive labels, and the fierce protection of the traditional narrative. It transforms a scientific discussion into a high-stakes drama over who gets to write and rewrite the story of human origins. The Sphinx, silent as ever, sits at the center of this storm, its weathered face a mirror reflecting our own deep need for a story to be true, and our profound anxiety when that story begins to change. The search for a middle ground in this heated debate has led some scientists down a different path entirely. A compelling compromise has emerged not from the sky above, but from the earth below. British geologist Colin, after his own extensive study of the Giza Plateau, proposed a theory that shifts the focus from torrential downpours to a more subtle, creeping force. He observed that the most severe erosion on the Sphinx is concentrated at the lowest parts of the enclosure walls, right where the monument meets the ancient ground level. This pattern, he argued, points not to rainfall from above, but to the persistent effects of groundwater. His idea centers on a process called capillary rise or osmosis. Imagine a sponge touching a puddle. The water doesn't just sit at the contact point, it gets drawn up into the dry material above it through tiny pores. Reader suggested that during certain periods in antiquity, the water table beneath Giza was significantly higher. Moisture from this saturated ground would have been constantly wicked upward through the porous limestone of the Sphinx and its enclosure walls. As this water evaporated from the stone's surface, it would leave behind dissolved salts. These salts would then crystallize inside the microscopic pores of the rock, a process called haloclasty. The growing crystals act like tiny wedges, exerting immense pressure from within, slowly but relentlessly fracturing the stone and causing the surface to crumble and flake away in those distinctive, rounded patterns. This mechanism requires moisture, but not necessarily a rainy climate. It could be driven by a high water table linked to a period when the Nile River flooded more powerfully or consistently, or during a known, shorter wet phase within the broader arid period. Reader's analysis led him to a nuanced conclusion. He agreed with Schoch that the weathering was too advanced to have occurred only since the time of Khafre, acknowledging the Sphinx must be older. However, he did not leap to the radical dates suggested by the rainfall theory. Instead, he used geological data to propose an earlier but still dynastic origin, placing the statue's construction in the early dynastic period, around 3,000 years before the Common Era. This was a time of emerging pharaonic power, just before the Pyramid Age dawned. This osmosis theory represents a fascinating evolution in the scientific conversation. It accepts the core geological observation of advanced, water-linked erosion, but seeks to explain it through a mechanism that fits more comfortably within the known archaeological timeline. It acknowledges a need for a revision, but a more conservative one. In doing so, it creates a vital bridge between the hard data of the rock and the material record of human culture. It shows how genuine scientific inquiry can refine a debate, not by choosing one extreme over the other, but by proposing a third way that respects evidence from both sides. The story of the Sphinx's age is no longer a simple binary argument, but a spectrum of possibilities, each with its own compelling logic waiting to be tested by the next discovery. The stone may hold its secrets, but science is learning new languages to ask the questions. The future of this ancient mystery could be unlocked not by another theory, but by a new generation of technology. Imagine a method that doesn't study the tools that carved the stone, but reads the stone's own atomic diary written by the sky itself. This is the promise of cosmogenic nuclide dating. When rock surfaces are exposed to the open air, They are constantly bombarded by cosmic rays from space. This interaction creates tiny amounts of rare isotopes, atomic variants that slowly build up within the minerals of the stone over time. By carefully measuring the concentration of these isotopes in the Sphinx's original limestone core, scientists could, in theory, calculate how long that surface has been exposed to weathering. It would be like finding a built-in clock that started ticking the moment the statue's shape was first revealed to the elements. The potential is breathtaking. It could provide a direct physical date for the erosion event itself, cutting through centuries of debate with hard nuclear data. Yet the path to that answer is fraught with immense practical challenges. The Sphinx is not a pristine, untouched cliff face. Its surface is a complex palimpsest of original stone, ancient repair blocks, and modern cement. A sample taken from the wrong spot, from a medieval repair or a 20th century patch, would give a completely misleading date. Furthermore, the technique requires a clear understanding of the rock's exposure history. Has it been buried, covered, or shielded at any point? For a monument that has been repeatedly excavated and restored, that history is incredibly murky. The very restorations meant to save the Sphinx may have inadvertently locked away the definitive proof of its age. While one technology seeks to date the past, others aim to recreate it with digital precision. Advanced three-dimensional laser scanning can now capture the monument's every contour, every fissure, and every hollow with millimeter accuracy, creating a supremely detailed digital twin. This is more than just a high-tech model. It is a new kind of laboratory. Researchers can feed this incredibly precise data into sophisticated computer simulations powered by artificial intelligence. These programs can model different weathering scenarios over vast timescales. They can simulate millennia of abrasive sandstorms, centuries of persistent groundwater seepage, or epochs of heavy tropical rainfall, applying these forces to the virtual Sphinx to see which process, over what duration, produces erosion patterns that match the real-world scan. This approach moves the debate from the realm of qualitative observation into quantitative testing. Instead of experts arguing over what a weathered feature looks like, they could run simulations. Does 2,000 years of wind abrasion on this specific limestone formation produce these deep vertical channels? What about 500 years of heavy runoff? The AI could analyze millions of data points, searching for the environmental story that best fits the digital evidence. This technological synergy offers a potential way out of the current stalemate. It provides a new, neutral ground where the hypotheses of geologists and the timelines of archaeologists can be stress-tested against a perfect digital replica of the monument itself. The goal is no longer to win an argument, but to find the simulation that fits the stone. In this quiet digital space, the Sphinx may finally begin to tell its story in a language both sides can understand, a language of data, models, and perhaps one day, a consensus carved not in stone but in code. While geologists read the story in stone, others have looked to the stars for answers. A different kind of clue emerges not from the monument's weathered body, but from the precise direction of its gaze. The Sphinx stares due east, directly at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the spring equinox. This alignment is powerful and intentional, linking the guardian to the cosmic cycle of rebirth. But for some researchers, this solar connection is just the beginning. The writer Robert Bovell proposed a far more ancient and specific celestial link. His work, often called the Orion correlation theory, primarily focused on the pyramids, suggesting their layout mirrored the stars of Orion's belt around 10,500 years before the Common Era. However, he extended this astronomical reasoning to the Sphinx. Bovell argued that if the pyramids represented Orion, then the lion-shaped Sphinx, facing east, could represent the constellation Leo. And not just Leo in any era, but Leo as it would have appeared on the spring equinox horizon in that same remote epoch, around 10,500 years ago. In that specific window of time, the constellation of the Lion would have risen directly ahead of the Sphinx at dawn on that important day, creating a perfect mirror between the earthly statue and its celestial counterpart. This idea is separate from the geological water erosion debate. It comes from a different field known as archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient cultures understood and incorporated the sky into their monuments. Yet, when you place these two separate threads side by side, a fascinating, though highly speculative, pattern emerges. The geological hypothesis, based on rainfall patterns, suggests the Sphinx endured a wet climate that ended over 5,000 years ago. The astronomical hypothesis, based on star alignments, points to a significant celestial event over 10,000 years ago. While they use completely different methods and evidence, both point toward a timeline of extreme antiquity, one that predates dynastic Egypt by many millennia. They become separate strands of inquiry that, for some, seem to weave together into a single, compelling narrative. Imagine, for a moment, a culture in that distant green Sahara. They live under a sky they know intimately, mapping the slow dance of the constellations over centuries. They decide to create an eternal monument, a lion carved from the living rock, not just as a symbol of power, but as a precise marker in time and space. They align it so that on the most important morning of their year, it locks eyes with the lion in the heavens. Then, centuries pass and the climate shifts. The rains that once fell heavily on their creation slowly cease, etching the very scars that future geologists would one day measure. The civilization itself may fade, its language forgotten, but the stone lion remains, its astronomical purpose gradually obscured, leaving only the silent, weathered mystery for a later culture to inherit and perhaps reinterpret. This is the grand vision that emerges when geology meets astronomy, a story of a monument serving as a time capsule for both earthly climate and cosmic order. It is important to stress that this synthesis is not accepted by mainstream scholars, who critique the astronomical correlations as selective and the geological interpretations as flawed. But its power lies in its holistic appeal. It offers a story where every puzzling aspect, the water scars, the leonine shape, the eastward gaze, finds a unified explanation in a single, lost epoch. The Sphinx transforms from a passive statue into an active instrument, a piece of ancient intellectual technology designed to bridge earth and sky. Whether one finds this narrative convincing or not, it underscores a profound truth about our relationship with this monument. We are not just analyzing an artifact, we are attempting to recover a lost conversation, a dialogue between a forgotten people and the universe they sought to understand, frozen forever in limestone under the relentless stars. The very stones used to mend the Sphinx tell their own story of deep time. If we look past the outer layers of modern restoration, we find evidence of much older repairs, interventions made during the New Kingdom over 3,000 years ago. These ancient masons used massive limestone blocks to rebuild parts of the statue's crumbling core, particularly around the shoulders and the hindquarters. The fascinating detail is the condition of these repair blocks themselves. They are not fresh, sharp stone. They are heavily weathered, bearing the same rounded, undulating scars as the original core body of the monument. This observation is a quiet bombshell. It means that by the time of pharaohs like Thutmose IV or Amenhotep II, around the 14th century before the Common Era, the Sphinx was not merely a revered symbol. It was already an ancient, deteriorating ruin in need of serious structural support. The blocks used to fix it were not newly quarried. They were salvaged from other, even older structures on the plateau, structures that had themselves been exposed to the elements long enough to acquire severe weathering. For those who support a much older Sphinx, this is a powerful, logical clue. The traditional timeline places the statue's construction around 2,500 years before the Common Era. That would mean just 1,000 years later, during the New Kingdom, it was already falling apart so badly that it needed a major reconstruction campaign. While stone can decay, such severe structural failure in that time frame seems unusually rapid for a monument of its scale, especially when compared to other Old Kingdom structures that remained largely intact. The extensive ancient repairs suggest a different history. They imply the Sphinx was already profoundly old by the time of the New Kingdom, having endured not just centuries, but perhaps millennia of exposure. The weathering on the repair blocks indicates they came from a landscape that had already passed through its period of greatest erosion. This creates a compelling sequence. First, the original Sphinx is carved and weathers heavily. Much later, a New Kingdom pharaoh, perhaps inspired by a dream or a sense of duty to the past, orders its restoration using stones that were themselves ancient relics. This scenario stretches the timeline backward dramatically. It paints the Sphinx not as a proud achievement of the Pyramid Age still in its prime, but as a mysterious, crumbling heirloom from a distant past, so old that its origins were already fading into legend when the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom looked upon it with awe. Yet the debate over the Sphinx is no longer confined to lecture halls and scientific journals. It lives and breathes in the world of popular media, a story told and retold in best-selling books, on countless internet forums, and through dramatic television documentaries. This public platform has been absolutely crucial for the water erosion theory, transforming a geological hypothesis into a global cultural phenomenon. The narrative that resonates most powerfully with audiences is a classic underdog story, the brilliant maverick scientist challenging the rigid, entrenched establishment. It is a frame that media outlets understand perfectly, pitting the lone truth seeker against the faceless academic institution. This portrayal, while compelling, inevitably simplifies the complex, nuanced science into a clear-cut battle of good versus evil, of open-mindedness versus dogma. Television documentaries, in particular, have played an outsized role. With sweeping cinematography of the monument's scars, intense musical scores, and the authoritative voice of a famous narrator, they present the theory not as a possibility, but as a revelation. The evidence feels immediate and visual, something a viewer can see with their own eyes, which often carries more weight than abstract archaeological arguments about pottery sequences or settlement patterns. This media coverage, regardless of its accuracy, has performed an essential service. It has kept the question alive. It has ensured that the Sphinx is not seen as a solved puzzle in a museum display case, but as an active mystery, a conversation still happening. This dynamic reveals a profound shift in how we engage with the past. Historical mysteries are no longer settled solely in the quiet pages of peer-reviewed journals. They are now argued in the vibrant, chaotic court of public opinion, where a compelling story, a striking image, and the thrill of a hidden truth can sometimes carry as much weight as a carefully footnoted argument. The public's fascination is not really about the minutiae of limestone erosion rates. It is about something deeper, the tantalizing possibility that our history is grander, older, and more mysterious than we have been told. The media feeds that hunger, and in doing so, ensures that the silent guardian of Giza will never be allowed to rest in the certainty of a single, settled story. The most persistent question echoes across the desert. Where is the rest of their world? For the water erosion theory to move from a compelling geological observation to a rewritten chapter of history, it requires the foundational proof of all archaeology, material evidence. A civilization capable of planning, quarrying, and sculpting a monument of the Sphinx's scale is not a ghost. It is a society of people who lived, worked, built homes, made tools, ate meals, and created art. They would have left a tangible footprint on the landscape, a scatter of pottery shards, the foundations of workshops, the resting places of their community. This evidential silence is the theory's most significant vulnerability. Mainstream scholars point to the vast and meticulously studied archaeological record of the Nile Valley. We have a remarkably clear, if incomplete, timeline showing the gradual evolution from small Neolithic farming villages to the sprawling state of the Old Kingdom. There is no sudden, unexplained leap in the record, no layer of sophisticated artifacts that vanishes without a trace. The tools, the settlements, the cultural markers all follow a logical progression. To propose a society advanced enough for the Sphinx in 7000 before the Common Era is to propose a brilliant flash in the pan that left no smoke. The argument from absence is powerful. If they were here, we would have found them by now. Proponents of a much older Sphinx offer a different perspective on this silence. They suggest we are not looking in the right places, or more accurately, we are not looking deep enough. The geography of Egypt is not static. The Nile River has been depositing its fertile silt for millennia, gradually raising the level of the floodplain and burying the ancient ground upon which early settlements would have been built. What if the cities or ritual centers of this precursor culture lie not on the current desert surface, but dozens of feet below the modern Egyptian farmland, entombed in layers of mud? Another possibility stretches to the west. During the African humid period, when the Sahara was green, human populations were not confined to the Nile Valley. They thrived across what is now an impassable desert. As the climate dried, these communities would have retreated toward the last reliable source of water, the Nile. Their original settlements, their central places, could be buried beneath the advancing dunes of the western desert, awaiting a chance discovery like the cave of swimmers depicted in the film The English Patient, a real prehistoric site found in such a remote location. The search, therefore, is not futile, but it is like looking for a needle in a sandbox the size of a continent. Until a bulldozer strikes a wall of neatly cut stone or a satellite image reveals the ghost of a street plan under the sand, the evidence remains potential, not proven. This evidentiary gap creates a fundamental impasse. It is the classic clash between different standards of proof. From the geological standpoint, the stone speaks for itself. Its weathering patterns are the evidence, a direct physical record of an ancient environment. From the archaeological standpoint, a monument cannot exist in a vacuum. It must be connected to the material culture that produced it, the everyday world of its builders. Without that connective tissue, the Sphinx becomes an anomaly, a magnificent orphan. Mainstream Egyptology holds the stronger hand in this debate precisely because its case is built on a mountain of interconnected finds, tombs, inscriptions, tools, and garbage heaps that all tell a consistent story. The water erosion theory asks us to accept a profound revision based primarily on one type of evidence, while the counterargument rests on the entire, painstakingly assembled puzzle of Egyptian prehistory. It is a reminder of a core scientific principle: extraordinary claims do indeed require extraordinary evidence. A single weathered statue, no matter how iconic, is a fragile thread from which to hang the weight of a lost civilization. The search continues, a slow scan of satellite data, a careful coring of Nile silt, a hopeful gaze across the endless sand. The truth may still be out there, waiting for the right shovel in the right place to finally break the silence. Science thrives not on certainty but on rigorous challenge. While the water erosion theory presents a compelling narrative, it is crucial to understand that Dr. Schoch's interpretation remains a minority view within the broader geological community. Many experts who specialize in rock weathering look at the same patterns on the Sphinx and arrive at a very different conclusion. They argue that the observed features can be fully explained by a combination of natural processes operating within the last 5,000 years, the very timeline supported by archaeology. Their case rests on the powerful, cumulative effects of the desert environment we see today. Even in an arid climate, rare but intense rainstorms do occur. A single torrential downpour on the Giza Plateau, funneling runoff into the Sphinx enclosure, could cause significant erosion in a short, violent burst. When you multiply such events over centuries and combine that water action with the relentless daily abrasion of wind-driven sand, the pervasive stress of salt crystallization from dew and groundwater, and the constant expansion and contraction of the limestone from extreme temperature swings, you have a potent recipe for weathering. Over millennia, this combination could sculpt those rounded hollows and deep fissures without requiring a single extended rainy epoch. This perspective reframes the monument's scars not as an anomaly, but as the expected result of its specific location and composition, enduring the known forces of the Egyptian desert for the conventional span of its history. The ongoing scrutiny from these quarters is not a dismissal, but a vital part of the scientific process. It ensures the water erosion theory is treated not as accepted dogma, but as a live hypothesis, one that must continually answer tough questions and withstand alternative explanations. This dynamic debate, this constant testing of ideas against evidence, is the essential engine that drives our understanding forward, reminding us that in the search for truth, healthy skepticism is just as important as bold revelation. This stone guardian, then, forces us to confront a much larger question. What is the true shape of history? Our modern minds are often trained to see the past as a straight line, a steady march from primitive beginnings toward greater complexity and control. We chart the invention of the wheel, the rise of agriculture, the building of cities, and the formation of empires as a clear, upward trajectory. This linear model provides comfort, a narrative of constant human progress where each generation builds upon the last. But what if that line is not the only shape? What if the story of humanity is not a steady climb, but something more like a spiral, or even a series of waves? The possibility of a vastly older Sphinx does not just add years to a timeline. It introduces the haunting idea of a cycle. It whispers of a civilization that achieved a peak of knowledge and organization, only to recede, its memory fading into myth, leaving behind only a single, weathered monument as a clue to its existence. This cyclical view of history is echoed in the legends of countless cultures, from the sunken continent of Atlantis described by Plato to the great cycles of creation and dissolution in Hindu cosmology. These are not necessarily literal truths, but they are profound metaphors for a recurring human experience, the rise and fall of cultures, the loss of knowledge, and the resilience of the human spirit to begin again. The water erosion theory, by suggesting a forgotten epoch of achievement, asks us to take these metaphors more seriously. It challenges the very foundation of cultural evolution as we have written it. If a society capable of such work existed in the deep past, then our neat timeline from simple to complex is incomplete. It means that technological and artistic sophistication may not be the exclusive property of the recent past. Our ancestors' capabilities might be profoundly underestimated. We tend to look at ancient peoples through the lens of what they lacked rather than what they possessed. We focus on the absence of steel or electricity, and in doing so, we might miss the depth of their understanding of astronomy, geology, and community. The Sphinx, if it is a relic from a green Sahara, stands as a testament to a different kind of intelligence, one deeply attuned to the land, the climate, and the cosmos, capable of projects that span generations with a purpose we can only guess at. This realization transforms how we look at all ancient wonders. The stones under our feet may hold stories we have not yet learned to read, not because the language is lost, but because we have been asking the wrong questions. We search for pharaohs' names and battle dates, while the monument itself is speaking of rainfall patterns and celestial alignments. It asks us to become better listeners, to read history not just in the words left behind, but in the silent testimony of form, placement, and erosion. Ultimately, this debate is about more than a statue's birthday. It is about humility. It is an acknowledgement that the past is vaster and more mysterious than any textbook can contain. Our current understanding is a map, but every map is a simplification of a far more complex territory. New discoveries, like a surprising weathering pattern or a chamber detected by seismic waves, are not errors on the map. They are invitations to redraw it, to expand our sense of what is possible. The Sphinx, in its silent endurance, teaches us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation between the present and a past that is still willing to surprise us. So we stand before the scale of history, placing the evidence carefully on each side. On one pan rests the undeniable physicality of the stone, its deep, flowing contours that speak so clearly of water's patient work, and the climatic record of a green Sahara that could have provided the downpour. It is evidence you can see and touch, grounded in the principles of geology. On the opposing pan rests the immense, interconnected weight of the archaeological record, a detailed tapestry of human progress in the Nile Valley that shows no sign of a thread capable of weaving such a monument thousands of years earlier. Here, the argument is built from pottery, tombs, settlements, and tools, a story told by the silent majority of everyday objects. The scale trembles, but it does not tip. A definitive verdict remains frustratingly, fascinatingly out of reach. The water erosion theory has not been proven, but it has also not been conclusively dismissed. It persists as a powerful and legitimate challenge, a hypothesis that refuses to be swept away by the sands of conventional wisdom. Its greatest achievement may not be in rewriting a date, but in revealing the limits of our current understanding. It has forced Egyptology to defend its chronology with more nuance, and it has invited geologists to apply their science to the human past in new ways. This intellectual friction is not a sign of failure, but of a healthy, living inquiry. The theory acts less like a battering ram meant to destroy the walls of history, and more like a crack in those walls, a narrow opening that lets in a sliver of unexpected light. That light does not illuminate a clear, new room. Instead, it sparkles on the dust of unanswered questions, making us wonder what else we might be missing in the shadows. It asks us to hold two contradictory ideas in our minds at once, to respect the solidity of the archaeological framework, while remaining genuinely open to the possibility that our map of the past is still missing entire continents. This unresolved tension is where the real mystery lies, not in a single answer, but in the enduring space between what we know and what the stones suggest. The Great Sphinx endures not just as a statue, but as a symbol. It represents the profound and humbling truth that history is a conversation, not a monologue. The water erosion theory, regardless of its final scientific standing, has performed an invaluable service to that conversation. It has challenged a comfortable complacency, forcing experts from different fields to speak to one another across the usual divides. A geologist's observation about rock patterns compelled archaeologists to re-examine their most fundamental timelines, and that kind of friction is where understanding grows. This dialogue reminds us that our past is not a closed book sitting on a shelf, its story finished. It is more like a living library, where new visitors can still find passages we have overlooked or read familiar lines in a startling new light. The theory encourages a humble and holistic approach to history. We must learn to listen to the stones as well as the texts, to the climate as well as the kings. A monument like the Sphinx does not belong solely to the realm of art history or political narrative. It is also a document of geology, a marker of astronomy, and a testament to environmental change. To understand it fully, we need all these voices at the table. This perspective transforms how we look at any ancient wonder. It asks us to see them not as isolated artifacts from a completed story, but as active participants in a much longer tale, one that includes the Earth itself as a primary character. The Sphinx's greatest secret may not be a hidden date or a lost haul of records, but this very lesson in interdisciplinary respect. As you leave this exploration, carry that question with you. Look at the other monuments, the other grand narratives we often accept without a second thought. What silent testimonies are we missing because we are only reading one language of evidence? The world is filled with stones that have stories to tell. If we are willing to listen with more than just our assumptions, we would love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the Sphinx guards a secret older than Egypt, or does the traditional timeline still hold the most weight for you? If you enjoyed this journey to the very edge of history, consider subscribing. We delve deep into the world's greatest mysteries, always seeking the questions hidden just beneath the surface of the answers we think we know.